The sun was bleeding out over the Appalachian peaks, and Robin still wasn't home. Martha Harper stood on the porch of their small cabin, her hands twisting in her apron. The air, thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, was growing cold. Every evening, Robin, their youngest, would come running from the woods when the dinner bell rang, her pockets full of smooth stones and her hair tangled with leaves. But tonight, there was no bell. Only a deepening silence that felt heavier than the coming night. Silas, her husband, came to stand beside her. He was a mountain of a man, carved from the same rugged timber as their home. But Martha could see the crack in his composure. A tiny muscle twitched in his jaw. "She'll come back soon," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was the same thing he'd said an hour ago, and the hour before that. Neither of them believed it anymore. Ezra, their eldest son, emerged from the tree line, his face grim. "I checked the creek again. Nothing." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced Martha's heart. The wilderness was their home, their provider. But it was also a hungry thing, a place of shadows and secrets, and it didn't care about a little girl with a curious heart. As the last sliver of light vanished, a decision was made without a single word. Silas grabbed his rifle from the mantel. Ezra pulled on his thickest boots. Before they stepped into the suffocating dark, the family gathered by the hearth. Nora, the middle child, held Robin's favorite rag doll, its button eyes staring into the flames. Martha clasped her hands, her voice a fragile thread in the quiet room. "Lord," she began, her voice trembling but firm, "guide their steps, protect our Robin wherever she is, put a shield around her and bring her home to us." Her prayer hung in the air, a desperate plea against the vast, listening darkness. Then Silas and Ezra lit their lanterns, the flickering glow pushing back the shadows just enough to show them the path into the forest. The night was a black wall of trees, and as they stepped through it, the door to the warm, safe cabin seemed a world away. Somewhere out there, in the cold and the dark, their little girl was alone, and the woods had already swallowed the sound of their footsteps. The forest was a different creature at night. The wind whispered through the pines like a troubled spirit, and every snap of a twig sounded like a predator's footfall. The rain had started, a cold, persistent drizzle that turned the forest floor into a slick carpet of mud and leaves. The lantern light danced and flickered, throwing grotesque shadows that seemed to writhe and reach for them. "Her tracks were here," Silas said, his voice tight. He knelt, holding the lantern low. In the mud, a faint, small boot print was slowly filling with water. She was following the creek. Ezra stood guard, his eyes scanning the impenetrable darkness around them. "Pa, do you think she's scared?" Silas didn't look up. He was tracing the ghost of a path with his fingertips. "She's a Harper. She's strong." He said it to convince himself as much as his son. "But this rain, it's washing everything away. We have to move faster." They pushed on, the mud sucking at their boots with every step. The trail was a phantom, a suggestion of a path that vanished and reappeared. It was Silas's gut, his lifetime of knowledge of these woods, that guided them now, and his gut was pulling him in a direction he didn't like, toward the Taylor place. The Taylor brothers, Jed and Hank, were a poison in the soil of this mountain. They lived in a dilapidated cabin that seemed to sag under the weight of its own misery, surrounded by rusted traps and the smell of poorly cured hides. They were mean-spirited, lazy, and held a grudge against Silas over a property line dispute that was older than Ezra. As Silas and Ezra broke through the trees into the Taylor's clearing, the sight confirmed Silas's dread. Smoke curled from the chimney. They were home, and Jed Taylor was sitting on his porch, slowly sharpening a long, wicked-looking hunting knife. The screech of metal on whetstone cut through the sound of the rain. Jed didn't look up, but a slow, cruel smirk spread across his face. Hank, his younger brother, lurked in the shadows behind him, shifting from foot to foot like a spooked horse. Well now, Jed drawled, his voice oily. Look what the storm dragged in. Didn't figure you for a social call, Harper. Silas stepped into the dim light of the tailor's porch lantern. Rain dripped from the brim of his hat, but his gaze was steady as stone. Robin's gone missing. We tracked her this way. Jed finally stopped sharpening his knife. He tilted his head, the smirk never leaving his lips. Is that a fact? Ezra's hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides. If you saw her, he bit out, his voice shaking with rage. If you saw a little girl out here alone and did nothing? Jed let out a low, gravelly chuckle. Wasn't our business to meddle. A child's got to learn her way in the woods. Toughens 'em up. The air went thick and heavy. Silas took a slow step forward, his shadow falling over Jed. His voice was dangerously quiet, colder than the rain. You left a child alone in a storm, Jed. He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. If I find out you had anything to do with her being lost, if you so much as looked at her wrong. He took another step. So close now he could smell the sour whiskey on Jed's breath. You'll answer to me, and the Lord won't be able to help you. For the first time, Jed's smirk faltered. His eyes flickered nervously toward the darkness of the woods behind Silas. Hank took a shuffling step back, deeper into the shadows. Jed, Hank mumbled, his voice a panicked whisper. Just let it go. Jed's jaw tightened. He glared at Silas for a long, hateful moment, then tossed the knife onto a rickety table with a clatter. Get off my land, Harper. As Silas and Ezra turned to leave, Ezra's eyes caught something. A tiny scrap of bright blue yarn snagged on a nail sticking out of the porch railing. It was the exact color of the sweater Martha had just finished knitting for Robin. Ezra's breath hitched, but he said nothing. He just followed his father back into the suffocating darkness. The image of that blue thread burned into his mind. The rain was coming down harder now, and a low rumble of thunder echoed through the mountains. The tailors knew more than they were saying. He was sure of it. The forest had become a maze of black trees and driving rain. The small piece of blue yarn was a smoking gun, proof that Robin had been right there on the porch of the two most dangerous men on the mountain. Silas's mind raced. Did they scare her off? Chase her deeper into the woods? Or something worse? Every father's nightmare played out in his head, each one more horrific than the last. He and Ezra pressed on, moving away from the Taylor cabin, trying to pick up Robin's trail again. It was almost impossible. The ground was a river of mud. But Silas noticed something strange, a single clear boot print pointing east, then another 20 feet later. They were too clean, too obvious. Pa, Ezra whispered, his voice tight with confusion. It's like the trail is starting over. Silas knelt down, his lantern casting a halo of light on the print. It was Robin's, no doubt, but it was pressed deep and perfect into the mud, as if someone had wanted it to be found. The rain should have blurred the edges, filled it with water, but it was pristine. A cold dread trickled down his spine. This wasn't a trail. It was a lure. Someone was leading them, and if they were being led, it was away from something, or toward something else. They're playing a game with us, Silas growled, his voice low and guttural. He stood up, his gaze sweeping the impenetrable wall of trees around them. They were being watched. He could feel it. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. He made a split-second decision. We're going off the path. But Pa, the tracks. The tracks are a lie, Silas cut in, his voice sharp as flint. They want us going east, so we're going west, toward the river. It was a gamble, a shot in the dark based on nothing but a father's intuition and a deep distrust of his neighbors. If he was wrong, they were wasting precious time, moving further away from their daughter with every step. But if he was right... They plunged into the thick, untracked underbrush. Branches whipped at their faces and thorns tore at their clothes. The roar of the swollen river grew louder, a constant, angry thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. The rain had lessened to a drizzle, but the river was a monster, a churning, violent beast of brown water and white rapids. They moved along the muddy bank, the ground treacherous and slick. Every breath was a prayer, every heartbeat was a drum pounding out a single word: Robin. Then Ezra stopped dead. His arm shot out, his fingers digging into Silas's coat. He didn't speak. He just pointed. Silas followed his son's trembling finger, and his heart seized in his chest. Across the raging river, tucked into a small hollow beneath the gnarled roots of a massive, uprooted oak tree, was a small, still shape. It was Robin. She was curled into a tiny ball, her blue dress soaked and caked with mud, blending into the earth. She was shivering violently, her small body convulsing with the cold. The wind tore at her hair, and for a terrifying moment, Silas thought she was gone. Then she moved. She lifted her head, her face pale as death in the moonlight that had just broken through the clouds. Her eyes, wide with a terror that went beyond just being lost and cold, found theirs across the water. Relief and horror crashed over Silas in a single gut-wrenching wave. She was alive. But she was trapped on the other side of a deadly, impassable river. "Robin!" Silas roared, his voice cracking, swallowed by the river's deafening crescendo. He took a step into the churning water, but Ezra yanked him back. "Pa, no! It'll sweep you away!" Ezra was right. The current was a liquid wall, powerful enough to drag a full-grown tree downstream. There was no swimming across this, no wading. Ezra was already ripping the coiled rope from his pack. His hands were shaking, but his voice was steady. "The log, Pa, upstream. It reaches most of the way." About 50 yards up, a massive fallen pine tree formed a makeshift bridge. It was slick with rain and moss, half submerged in the furious current, but it was their only chance. "Tie it around me," Ezra said, his eyes fixed on his sister across the river. "I'll go first. I'm lighter." Silas didn't argue. He wrapped the thick rope around his own waist, anchoring himself to a sturdy birch tree, and then secured the other end around Ezra's chest. There was no time for fear, no room for doubt. Ezra started across the log, his arms outstretched for balance. Each step was a terrifying gamble. The log shifted and groaned under his weight, the water spraying up and soaking him to the bone. He was halfway across when the sound came. A low, menacing growl that cut through the roar of the river. It came from the trees behind Robin. Silas whipped his head around, lifting his lantern high. His blood ran cold. At the edge of the woods, not 20 feet from where his daughter lay trembling, a wolf stood watching her. Its fur was matted and dark with rain, its yellow eyes glowing like hot coals in the lantern light. Its lips were peeled back in a silent snarl, revealing a set of long, white fangs. It wasn't just a wolf, it was a predator that had found its prey. It took a slow, deliberate step forward, its muscles coiling, its body low to the ground. It was getting ready to pounce. "Pa!" Ezra screamed from the log, his voice filled with a primal terror. Silas's hands went to his rifle. He lifted it to his shoulder, the cold, wet steel a familiar weight. He took aim, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. But then he remembered. The rain, the hours of being drenched. The powder was wet. He had one shot. That was it. If he missed, if the powder failed, the wolf would be on Robin before he could even think to reload. The wolf crouched lower, its haunches bunching. Its tail was stiff, its entire body a spring of coiled muscle, ready to explode into deadly motion. Silas held his breath. He centered the wolf's glowing eyes in his sights. He ignored the shaking in his hands, the roar of the river, his son's terrified shouts. There was only him, the rifle, and the beast. He squeezed the trigger. The gunshot was a deafening crack of thunder that ripped through the night. The bullet didn't hit the wolf. Silas had aimed low. It slammed into the mud just in front of its paws, kicking up a spray of dirt and water. The wolf let out a startled yelp, a sound of surprise and pain, and it scrambled backward, its predatory focus shattered. It spun on its heels and bolted, vanishing into the blackness of the trees as if it were a ghost. Silas didn't lower the rifle. He kept it trained on the spot where the wolf had been, his ears straining, listening for its return. But there was only the sound of the river and the pounding of his own heart. It was gone. Ezra didn't waste a second. He scrambled the rest of the way across the log, his feet slipping, his hands grabbing at the slick bark. He leaped the last few feet onto the muddy bank and dropped to his knees beside Robin. "Robin!" he gasped, his hands hovering over her, afraid to touch her, afraid she might break. "Robin, it's me. You're safe." He gently wrapped the rope around her small waist, his fingers fumbling with the knot. She stirred, a low moan escaping her lips. Her eyes fluttered open, but they were glazed over, unfocused. "I've got you," Ezra whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I've got you." On the other side of the river, Silas dug his heels into the mud, bracing himself. "Hold on tight!" he yelled, his voice raw. Ezra scooped his sister into his arms. She was terrifyingly light. He held her close to his chest and carefully, painstakingly, started the journey back across the log. The river snarled and clawed at them from below, a hungry beast trying to drag them into its depths. Silas pulled on the rope, a steady, unyielding pressure, reeling his children in from the jaws of the wilderness. With one final, desperate lunge, Ezra was back on the bank. Silas grabbed them both, pulling them into an embrace so tight it felt like he was trying to fuse them all together. He knelt in the mud, his hand stroking Robin's soaking wet hair. She looked up at him, her lips blue with cold, a single tear tracing a clean path through the dirt on her cheek. "Papa," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You came." "I promised I would," he said, his own voice choked with a relief so profound it felt like pain. She clung to him, her small body trembling uncontrollably. "I prayed, Papa. I prayed so hard." He held her tighter, pressing his face into her hair, breathing in the scent of rain and river mud and the undeniable miracle of his daughter, alive and in his arms. "He heard you, Robin," Silas whispered into the stormy night. "He heard you." But as he held her, he felt something else in her gaze. Not just relief, not just fear of the cold or the wolf. It was something deeper, a terror that hadn't vanished with the predator. She hadn't just been lost, something else had happened out here in the dark. The first light of dawn was a weak gray watercolor washing over the bruised-looking sky. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a world that felt raw and new. Silas carried Robin, wrapped in his coat, her small head resting on his shoulder. Ezra walked beside them, his steps heavy with an exhaustion that went bone deep. When their cabin came into view, nestled in the clearing, a figure burst from the door. It was Martha. She ran to them, her face a mask of sleepless agony, and when she saw Robin, a choked sob escaped her lips. She gathered her daughter into her arms, burying her face in Robin's damp hair. "Oh, thank the Lord," she wept. "Thank you, Lord." Inside, the cabin was a haven of warmth and light. A fire roared in the hearth, chasing the chill from their bones. Nora had a basin of warm water ready, and she gently cleaned the mud from Robin's face and hands, while Martha stripped off her wet clothes and wrapped her in the thickest quilt. Robin was tucked into her small bed by the fire, her breathing finally evening out, a touch of color returning to her cheeks. She was safe, but the feeling of danger hadn't left the cabin. It lingered in the corners, a shadow that the firelight couldn't quite reach. Ezra stood at the window, staring out at the mist-shrouded forest. "Pa," he said, his voice low, not turning around. "That yarn, on the tailor's porch, it was from her sweater." Silas came to stand beside him. The whole night replayed in his mind. The fake trail, the tailor's smug denials, the wolf that appeared as if on cue. It felt like a series of carefully placed traps. "You think they drove her toward the river?" Ezra asked, his voice shaking with a quiet, simmering rage. "I don't know what to think," Silas admitted, his voice grim. "But I know I don't trust them. I don't trust any of it." Just then, Robin stirred in her bed. Her eyes fluttered open wide and filled with a lingering fear. She looked past her mother, past Nora, her gaze fixing on Silas. "Papa," she whispered, her voice raspy. Silas was at her side in an instant, kneeling by the bed. "I'm here, little bird. You're safe now." "No," she whispered, and a fresh wave of shivers racked her small body. "The smiling man. He scared me." Silas and Martha exchanged a look of pure confusion. "The smiling man? Who, Robin?" Martha asked gently. "Was it Mr. Taylor?" Robin shook her head, her eyes welling up with tears. "No, not him. The other one, the one in the woods." Her hand, trembling, went to the small pocket of her dress. "He gave me this," she whimpered. "He said it would keep the monsters away." Slowly, her fingers pulled out a small object. It was a piece of wood, crudely carved into the shape of a snarling wolf. It was small, dark, and felt cold to the touch. It was nothing like the simple toys Silas carved for her. This was different, older, and it felt wrong. Ezra came closer, his eyes narrowing on the small carving. He'd seen work like this before. Old Man Hemlock, the hermit who lived deep in the mountains, a man people whispered about, a man who kept to himself and was said to practice old, dark magic. The Taylors were just cruel and stupid. This felt like something else entirely, something ancient and sinister. The small wooden wolf sat on the mantel, its carved snarl seeming to mock the warmth of the cabin. It felt like an omen, a piece of the dark woods brought inside their home. The smiling man. Old Man Hemlock. The name hung in the air, a new and unknown threat that made the Taylors seem like a simple nuisance. Was it possible? Had the hermit found her? Why would he give her such a strange, unsettling gift? Martha wouldn't let them speak of it. She declared that the house needed prayer, a cleansing of the fear that had taken root. They knelt together, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. But even as Silas closed his eyes and listened to his wife's steady, faithful voice, his mind was racing. The trail that was a lie, the conveniently appearing wolf, the carving. It was all a tangled knot he couldn't unravel. The next day, a fragile peace settled over the cabin. Robin was weak but recovering, her sleep troubled by nightmares she couldn't explain. Silas spent the day chopping wood with a furious energy, each swing of the axe a blow against the fear and uncertainty that gnawed at him. Ezra, however, was a coiled spring of restless anger. He couldn't sit still. He paced the floor, his eyes constantly drifting to the wooden wolf on the mantel. "He's the one," Ezra said that afternoon, his voice low and hard. "Hemlock, the Taylors were probably just trying to scare us off, but he's the one who found her. He did something to her, Pa. He terrified her." "We don't know that," Silas said, though he shared his son's suspicion. "We don't know anything for sure." "I'm going to find out," Ezra declared. "No," Silas said firmly. "You're not going anywhere near that man's cabin. He's dangerous. People stay away from him for a reason." A stubborn fire lit in Ezra's eyes. It was the same fire Silas saw in himself. "She's my sister. I'm not going to sit here and do nothing while the man who hurt her is hiding up on that ridge." Before Silas could stop him, Ezra had grabbed his coat and was out the door. He moved with a speed and determination that left no room for argument. Silas watched him disappear into the tree line, a cold knot of dread tightening in his stomach. A boy's anger was a dangerous and unpredictable thing. He was going to confront the Taylors. Silas knew it as sure as he knew the sun would set, and he feared what might happen when his son's righteous fury met the Taylors' casual cruelty. He grabbed his rifle. He couldn't let Ezra face them alone. But as he stepped out the door, he saw something that made him freeze. A fresh set of tracks in the mud near their woodpile. Not his, not Ezra's. They were large boot prints, caked in the dark, peaty soil from the high mountains. The kind of soil found only on Hemlock's Ridge. The hermit hadn't just met Robin in the woods. He had been here, watching their home. Ezra stormed through the woods, his rage a hot fire in his chest. He didn't bother with the path. He crashed through the underbrush, making a straight line for the Taylor cabin. He imagined the confrontation 100 times in his head, grabbing Jed by his filthy shirt, slamming him against a wall, forcing the truth out of him. But when he burst into their clearing, the scene that greeted him was not what he expected. There was no smirking Jed, no lurking Hank. The cabin door was wide open, swinging eerily in the breeze. Inside, a chair was overturned. A tin plate of half-eaten food sat on the floor, flies buzzing around it. The place was a mess, but it was a mess of panic, not laziness. It looked like they had left in a hurry. "Jed! Hank!" Ezra yelled, his voice echoing in the unnerving silence. Nothing. He cautiously stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of stale sweat and fear. On the floor near the overturned chair was a dark, wet stain. Ezra knelt down, his heart pounding. It wasn't blood. It looked like swamp water. Then he heard it, a low, whimpering sound. It was coming from the small, dilapidated shed behind the cabin. Ezra pulled the hunting knife his father had given him from its sheath and moved toward the shed. The door was barred from the outside with a heavy piece of timber. Someone had locked them in. He lifted the bar and threw the door open. Hank Taylor was huddled in the far corner, his eyes wide with terror. He was shaking so hard his teeth were chattering. He looked like a cornered animal. "Where's Jed?" Ezra demanded, his knife still held at the ready. Hank flinched, scrambling backward until he hit the wall. "He took him," Hank whimpered, his voice a pathetic, broken thing. "The old man? Hemlock? He came for us." Ezra's mind reeled. "What are you talking about?" "It wasn't us," Hank cried, tears streaming down his grimy face. "We saw the girl, yeah? We saw her wandering toward the old wolf den upriver. We were going to leave her be. Jed said it'd teach you a lesson about that property line." His confession came out in a torrent of panicked words. "But then he showed up. Hemlock. He came out of the trees like a ghost. He wasn't smiling. He just looked at her, and she followed him. He led her away. We got scared, Ezra. Jed said we should make a false trail. Lead your pa away from Hemlock's Ridge. He said you don't mess with that man. Nobody does." Hank took a ragged breath, his eyes darting toward the open shed door as if expecting the hermit to appear. "Last night, after you and your pa left, Hemlock came here. He didn't say a word. He had this look in his eyes. Jed tried to fight him. Hemlock. He's stronger than he looks. So much stronger. He dragged Jed out of here. He said Jed had disturbed the mountain's balance, that a debt had to be paid." Suddenly, the threat wasn't two mean-spirited neighbors anymore. It was a mysterious, powerful mountain man who had taken Robin, terrified the Taylors into silence, and had now dragged Jed away to an unknown fate. The wooden wolf on the mantel wasn't a gift. It was a warning. At that exact moment, Silas was standing over the tracks by his woodpile. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't wait for Ezra. He couldn't wait for answers. He had to go to the source. He had to go to Hemlock's Ridge. Leaving Martha and Nora with strict instructions to bolt the door and not open it for anyone, he started the long, steep climb up the mountain. The air grew thinner, colder. The trees were older here, their branches twisted into strange, skeletal shapes. A thick mist clung to the ground, muffling all sound. It felt like entering another world, a place governed by older, darker rules. The cabin was almost invisible, built into the side of the mountain itself, made of dark, moss-covered stone and timber. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, the only sign of life. Silas approached cautiously, his rifle held ready. There was no porch, no yard, just the forest and the cabin. He called out, his voice sounding small and weak in the oppressive silence. "Hemlock, my name is Silas Harper. I need to talk to you." The heavy wooden door creaked open. The man who stood there was not what Silas expected. He was old, yes, with a long gray beard and hair that fell to his shoulders. But his eyes, they were a startlingly clear blue, and they held no malice, only a deep, profound sadness. He wasn't smiling now. He looked weary, ancient as the mountains themselves. "I know who you are," the old man said, his voice raspy from disuse. "I've been waiting for you." He stepped aside, gesturing for Silas to enter. Against his better judgment, Silas went inside. The cabin was a single room, surprisingly clean and sparse. Herbs hung from the rafters and books were stacked in neat piles on the floor. A small fire crackled in the hearth. And tied to a chair in the corner, bruised and unconscious, was Jed Taylor. "He's the reason your girl got lost," Hemlock said, his voice calm. "He and his brother. They have a habit of baiting the wolves near the river, trapping them for their pelts. They had just set a new line of traps. They saw your daughter heading right for them." Silas stared at the old man, then at Jed. "Hank said they saw you lead her away." Hemlock nodded slowly. "I did. I found her just moments before she would have stepped into one of their snares. The river was rising. The wolves were active. She was in terrible danger." He walked over to a small table and picked up a half-finished carving. Another wolf. "I am not a man of many words, Silas Harper. Children are often frightened of me. I tried to calm her. I gave her a totem, a charm of protection." He looked at Silas, his clear blue eyes piercing. "The fear you saw in her, it was not of me. It was of what she had just escaped, and of the man who led her there. Everything was clicking into place, but one piece was still missing." "The wolf," Silas said. "The one that came for her by the river. I shot at it." Hemlock's face darkened. A shadow passed over his features. "That," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl, "was not one of my wolves." "Your wolves?" Silas asked, his hand tightening on his rifle. "The wolves of this mountain know me," Hemlock said. "They are my companions. We have an understanding. They do not hunt near the river when the traps are set. They are intelligent creatures. But the one you saw, it was different." He walked over to the bound form of Jed Taylor and roughly pulled up his sleeve. On Jed's forearm was a fresh, deep scratch, 3 parallel claw marks, still red and angry. "He doesn't just trap them," Hemlock said, his voice laced with a cold fury. "He tries to tame them. He caught a young male weeks ago, has been starving it, beating it, training it to be vicious, an attack dog." Silas felt the blood drain from his face. The wolf hadn't just appeared. It had been sent. "When I brought him here," Hemlock continued, "I found this in his pocket." He reached into his own coat and pulled out a small, tattered piece of blue cloth. It was the sleeve of a child's sweater. It had been ripped clean off. He wasn't just going to let her get caught in a trap, Silas. He sent his pet after her. He was going to make it look like a tragic accident, all to get you and your family off the land he thinks is his. The truth was a physical blow. It knocked the wind out of him. Jed Taylor hadn't just been cruel or negligent. He had tried to murder his daughter. He had sicked a half-starved, maddened wolf on a little girl. The false trail, the lies. It was all a cover for a crime so monstrous Silas could barely comprehend it. Suddenly, a commotion from outside broke the silence. It was Ezra's voice, yelling his father's name. Silas rushed to the door. Ezra was running up the path, Hank Taylor stumbling behind him. "Pa!" Ezra yelled, his face pale with panic. "Pa! It was Jed!" Hank told me everything. He sent a wolf after her, a tame one." Silas turned and looked at the old hermit. Hemlock simply nodded, his ancient eyes filled with a grim understanding. The final piece of the puzzle had just been delivered. Justice on this mountain was not found in a courtroom. It was found in the woods, under the eyes of God and the ancient trees. And Silas Harper was about to deliver it. The full, monstrous truth settled over the small group outside the hermit's cabin. Jed hadn't just been negligent, he had actively tried to murder a child. The wolf by the river wasn't a random act of nature. It was a weapon. The false trail wasn't a prank. It was an alibi. Ezra stared at the unconscious form of Jed Taylor inside the cabin, his young face contorted with a mixture of horror and pure, undiluted hatred. Hank was blubbering, collapsed in a heap on the ground, a pathetic monument to his own cowardice. Silas looked at Hemlock, two men of the mountain, from different worlds, now bound by a shared, terrible knowledge. "What you do now is your own business," the old hermit said, his voice as quiet as the mist. "He has violated the laws of this mountain. He brought a darkness here that must be cleansed." He turned and walked back into his cabin, shutting the heavy door behind him, leaving the Harpers to their reckoning. Silas walked over to Jed. He cut the ropes binding him to the chair and hauled him to his feet. Jed sputtered, his eyes blinking open, wild with confusion and fear as he saw Silas's face. "Harper!" he rasped. "I didn't! It was an accident!" "There are no accidents like this, Jed," Silas said, his voice devoid of all emotion. It was colder and harder than the stone of the mountain. He began marching Jed down the treacherous path, away from Hemlock's cabin, back toward the river. Ezra fell into step beside him, his hand never leaving the knife at his belt. Hank scrambled to follow, wringing his hands. "What are you gonna do?" Hank whimpered. Silas didn't answer. He just kept walking. They reached the spot on the riverbank where Silas and Ezra had stood just the night before, the spot from which they had seen Robin, small and helpless. The river was calmer now, but its power was still visible in the steady, deep current. Silas shoved Jed forward, sending him stumbling to his knees in the mud. "You made my daughter pray for her life on that bank," Silas said, his voice a low growl. "You made her feel the breath of a predator on her skin." "It got out of control," Jed pleaded, his eyes darting between Silas and Ezra. "I just wanted to scare you off the land. I never meant for her to get hurt." "You tore the sleeve from her sweater," Silas said, his voice flat. "You sent a starved animal to kill a child, my child." He looked at Ezra. "Go home to your mother. Tell her it's done." Ezra hesitated, his eyes burning with a need for vengeance. He wanted to be a part of this. But he saw the look on his father's face, a look of grim, absolute finality. And he knew this was not a task for a boy. This was a burden for a father. He nodded, gave Jed one last look of utter contempt, and turned back toward the woods, calling for Hank to follow. Now it was just Silas and Jed. The river flowed beside them, a silent witness. "Please, Silas," Jed begged, crawling backward in the mud, "for the love of God." Silas looked up at the sky, at the ancient peaks that had stood guard over this land for millennia. "God has heard enough prayers from this riverbank for one lifetime," he said. "He heard my daughter's. He heard my wife's. I don't think he's interested in hearing yours." He uncoiled the rope from his shoulder, the same rope that had saved his daughter's life. He didn't use the rifle. A gunshot was too loud, too clean. It would be over too quickly. No, this needed to be quiet. It needed to be deliberate. It needed to be justice, Appalachian style. The next morning, the sun rose over a mountain that felt cleaner, lighter. At the Harper cabin, the family sat around the breakfast table. The small wooden wolf was gone from the mantel, thrown into the hottest part of the fire the night before. Robin was laughing, a real, genuine laugh, as she watched Nora make a funny face. The sound was the sweetest music Silas had ever heard. Martha caught his eye from across the table. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't need to. She saw the grim resolution in her husband's face, the weary peace in her son's. She saw that the shadow had passed, and that was enough for her. She reached across the table and placed her hand on his. Her touch was an absolution. No one ever saw Jed Taylor again. Hank, terrified of what he had witnessed and what he knew Silas was capable of, packed his few belongings and was gone by noon, vanishing from the mountains like a puff of smoke. Sometimes, hunters would speak of a strange, wild man living deep in the swampiest part of the forest, a man who shied away from light and mumbled to himself. But no one ever went looking for him. The Harper family stayed. They worked their land, their faith not broken by the ordeal, but forged stronger in the fire of it. They understood that the world held both inexplicable darkness and profound grace. They had faced the monster, and the monster was just a man, a greedy, hateful man whose evil was no match for a father's love. The mountains kept their secrets, as they always do. But for the Harpers, the woods were no longer a place of fear. They were home, protected, and at peace. If this story of a family's resilience and a father's unwavering love kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button for more tales of darkness and deliverance.